All right, so last week we had looked in this particular unit, the Road to Revolution, 1754 through 1800. We had reviewed the Creating a Nation section a little bit, and then I had we had reviewed the American Revolution section, and then this week for homework I had you guys review the Creating a Nation section. So were you guys able to finish that?
Yeah.
All right. So you were able to finish it, Benji?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So today, since our time was used for another discussion a little bit, last time we didn't get to cover everything I wanted to look at in this American Revolution section, so we're going to quickly look at three important articles. No, never mind. The Declaration of Independence is a video there, so we're just going to look at two of the articles from this section. The first being the Intolerable Acts and the First Continental Congress. It's an article there in the first section. These are the First and Second Continental Congresses are important, which is why I wanted to cover them. So I'm going to read the overview here, and then we're going to look through this article. Is everybody there? All right. In the spring of 1774, the British Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which quickly became known in the North American colonies as the Intolerable Acts. So we remember that a little bit. The Intolerable Acts were aimed at isolating Boston, the seat of the most radical anti-British sentiment from the other colonies. That was what took up most of our discussion last time. Colonists responded to the Intolerable Acts with a show of unity, which was the complete opposite of what the British Empire wanted them to do. They wanted to split them up. That's why they isolated Boston. Convening the First Continental Congress to discuss and negotiate a unified approach to the British. Okay, so let's go ahead and we remember everything here with the Stamp Act and the and some of the acts that were really hard on the colonists. And do you guys remember why those acts were originally given? Do you guys remember what had happened before? That was like really heavy on the British Empire.
The Revolution.
Not the Revolution. The Revolution hadn't happened yet.
Oh.
It was a war that took place.
The French and Indian War.
Yeah, the 7 Years' War, as it also is known. Yeah, same thing. And so yeah, that was what had that done to the British Empire.
They got in a lot of debt.
Yeah, there was a lot of costs involved, and so that policy that they put on the colonists through these acts, which were taxing things like what? Do you guys remember?
Paper?
Yeah, like the Stamp Act, which taxed printing companies and journalists and students and different things like that. And what was the other act? Do you guys remember? I'll try to do a little search. It was the Townsend Acts, which were taxes that had to do more with merchandise and things like that and trading. And so these taxes were coming in, and you guys remember the famous slogan? This is a really kind of an important thing to remember.
No taxation, representation.
You said it last time, dude.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. So they felt as if it was unfair to them because they weren't being represented in the British Parliament, and those things were being kind of thrown at them. But at the same time, the British were saying that according to some theory, that they were doing it for the good of the British Empire, so they did have a right to tax them like that. So there was kind of an argument going on there, and all this was boiling up to what were some of the things that happened as a result of this tension, these revolutionary ideas. There's some famous acts, or there's some famous events that took place.
Boston.
Yeah, there was the Boston Tea Party, the massacre, yeah, things like that, and all these things were just making this get worse and worse and worse. And so as we just read, they isolated Boston via the Intolerable Acts, which allowed several things to happen as we look in this article. Number one was the Port Bill, which were saying that Boston had to basically pay for what they did through the Boston Tea Party. The Government Bill, which made it to where they couldn't even have their own mayor anymore. They basically sent a governor over themselves to administrate that place. The Administration of Justice Act, which had people sent over to Britain to be tried and the Quartering Act, which allowed British soldiers, to stay wherever they wanted, basically. Okay, so let's go down to this part of the article that says Forging Unity, the First Continental Congress. And Naomi, why don't you read the first two paragraphs
What's
there?
going on in that picture?
Oh yeah. You can read about it underneath.
In this British political cartoon, which was reprinted in the American colonies, notable members of Parliament hold down an allegorical figure of America
No.
and force tea down her throat. The London magazine, The Able Doctor, or America Swallowing the Bitter Draught. That was a really popular thing back then, and even in the following decades, they would. That was the media back then. They'd write political cartoons like that. There was a lot of them. It's obviously supposed to be a little
What?
It's
bad.
drawings back then were crude.
Like the woman is supposed to represent America, and the men around her are supposed to represent the British Parliament.
Yeah.
Anyways, Naomi, read the first two
I
paragraphs.
didn't mean to read.
Wow.
Actually, Naomi's being too eagerly. Elijah, read the first two paragraphs.
Well, I went off where we were.
The
and then I
Intolerable
can't
Acts
find
and the First
Oh, there it
Continental
is.
Congress.
That was me.
So we're reading Forging. Oh yeah.
Yep.
Instead of isolating Boston from the other North American colonies, the Intolerable Acts had the opposite result. Delegates from all the colonies except Georgia gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress in autumn of 1774. The purpose of the Congress was to show support for Boston and to work out the
Unified.
unified approach to the British. Nevertheless, divisions plagued the colonies. The Congress agreed to implement a boycott of the British imported goods.
And what is a boycott again?
I don't know. I forget.
It was related to something that happened a little bit before this, which was called the Non-Importation Agreement.
Where British ships can come.
Yeah, they were basically saying we're not going to accept any more goods from you guys, and that was what made the British really angry and send over their navy. Like, okay, you guys are in trouble because we need the money that comes through us sending goods over. Okay, keep going.
The northern and southern colonies argued fiercely over the measure to ban all exports to Britain. The southern colonies were economically dependent on revenues from their exports of raw materials such as cotton, rice to the motherland.
I'm just joking. Good.
Motherland.
Why do they call it the motherland?
Because
The mothership.
because the colonies at this point are still technically a part of the British Empire, and Britain is basically the controlling center. It's the motherland.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Delegates ultimately reached a compromise, agreeing that all exports to Britain, Ireland, and the British West Indies would be banned after a year starting in September 1775. This would give southern colonies some time to prepare for the economic impact of the export ban.
So in other words, what are they doing there? Through the Congress and some of the agreements they made there, as the colonies came together in this first Continental Congress, what are they saying? What are they going to do?
They're going to.
It says it in the third line there of that last paragraph that we just read. Over a measure to what? They argued fiercely over a measure to what? Yeah, they're going to ban exports to Britain. So instead of imports, they're now saying now we're not going to send anything over to Britain. Instead of banning and not allowing Britain to import things to us, we're not going to export things to Britain. And which colonies specifically were going to potentially suffer from that the most? I just mentioned it.
Philadelphia.
Which colonies?
Oh, sorry.
Southern.
The southern colonies, yeah, because Elijah just read here the southern colonies were economically dependent on revenues that they received from exporting those materials like rice and cotton to Britain or to the motherland.
I have to go to the bathroom really fast.
Okay. So they reached a compromise. A compromise. Let's look at the definition of that, because it will actually be an important word as we look into how America was founded. An agreement or settlement is, I'm defining the word compromise. So it's basically an agreement of a dispute that is reached by each side making concessions. So basically, it's kind of like a. It's really interesting but important word. So let's look at some of the other definitions here. A middle state between conflicting opinions or actions reached by mutual concession or modification. Man, they really don't help with a definition because they still use a bunch of big words. How do I explain this simply? So
Siri knowledge.
it has to do with the conclusion of an argument, kind of, right? So we reach an agreement. I'm going to have to let go of some things that I want, and you're going to have to let go of some things that you want in order to reach this, in order for us to kind of work together in a sense.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it is.
So the compromise in this case was that the colonies were going to ban exports or sending things out after, or that is to Britain, Ireland, and the British West Indies, so all part of the British Empire, after a year. So they were going to wait a year to do that.
But why did they do that then?
Because it just said they were going to give the southern colonies, who were going to be affected really bad, they were going to give them time to prepare for the halting of those exports.
But why did they halt the exports?
Because that they were, because it was in response to the things that the Kingdom of Britain was doing to the colonies. And what were those things? They were doing the Intolerable Acts, right?
Right.
Like they were really narrowing in on Boston, which was the main revolutionary city or town, whatever it was at the time. So these were reactionary things. They were happening in response to things that were already happening. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
This was building up to the war. Okay, Esther, can you read the last two paragraphs there?
Starting on October.
Huh?
We're starting on October.
Yes.
On October 14th, 1774, the First Continental Congress issued the Declaration of Colonial Rights and Grievances. The Declaration denied Parliament's right to tax the colonies and lambasted the British
Which criticize is what that means.
for stationing troops in Boston. It characterized the Intolerable Acts as an assault on colonial.
So this is basically answering your question of why they did this export ban. This is why.
Rejected British attempts to circumscribe representative government and requested that the colonies prepare their I don't know how to say that.
Militias.
Militias. Despite its harsh tone, the Declaration did affirm Parliament's right to regulate trade and did not challenge colonial royalty to the British monarch, King George III.
So you can kind of see that the kind of the sort of attitude that they're carrying in writing this first Declaration of Colonial Rights and Grievances, they're still. It kind of seems like they're almost still giving the British Empire a chance to continue to be, in a sense, their ruling order. So they're responding to what they consider to be intolerable, like the acts and the taxes that they're putting on them, and these regulations that they're allowing soldiers to stay in wherever they want, and all these restrictions that they're putting on them. But they're saying that if these are loosened and we can reach a compromise ourselves with you, the British Empire, then we'll allow you to continue as Parliament to regulate trade and stuff as you were before. We just want to reach a compromise. Let's see, this word is going to continually come into play because it's very important. Okay, Esther, go ahead. Last one.
Although some of the more radical delegates, particularly Samuel Adams, already believed that the war was inevitable, the Congress did not seek or declare independence from Britain at this time. The delegates agreed to meet again the following May. Anglo-American relations did not approve.
So people in the colonies, as it already kind of hinted towards here, they didn't all agree with each other. Some were saying, yeah, we definitely are going to war. It would be really awesome if we separated into our own independent nation. But other people were saying, well, you're being way too hasty there. We need to kind of figure this out, maybe reach a compromise where we still are a part of the British Kingdom, but we just make sure these intolerable acts aren't a thing anymore. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like there's still a lot of discussion, a lot of argument, even within the colonies, definitely, during the time. Okay, so let's go over to, let's see. So then we see the following article. We don't have to look at it too much. Is Lexington and Concord, which is where I think the American Revolution really breaks out. So it gives some explanation of the Patriots, and you read all that, right?
Yep.
Just of some of the things that happened in the actual war, some of the main people that fought in that war. Let's see. So in the end of this article, you don't have to be there, I'll just read it out loud. The militiamen proceeded to lay siege to Boston, where they were joined by militias from Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. These colonial forces would be constituted as the Continental Army by the Second Continental Congress, which we're about to read. The American Revolutionary War had begun. So let's look at the Second Continental Congress. I'll read the overview here. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in the summer of 1775, shortly after the war with the British had begun. It was preceded by the First Continental Congress in the fall of 1774, so about a year before that. The Continental Congress appointed George Washington as the commander of the Continental Army, which obviously would be fighting in the Revolutionary War, and authorized the raising of the army through conscription. Conscription is, the definition is basically obligatory enlistment for state service. So basically people were conscripted into the army. On July 4th, which is July 4th?
Declaration of
Independence Day.
Fireworks.
1776. That's an important date to remember as an American. July 4th, the Congress issued the Declaration of Independence, which I think they had a video of here, if you guys remember that good, which, for the first time, asserted the colony's intention to be fully independent of the mother country. So by 1776, they're like, yep, we've made the decision. We're going to be a completely independent country. Or, in that, the colonies were still, in many ways, their own country still. Like, they were uniting to be able to, they were uniting against the mother country, because if they had not been united, it wouldn't have worked in a sense. But in many ways, the colonies were still their own states, in many ways. And it wasn't going to be until sometime later that they would actually bring about an effective and powerful U.S. government that combined them as the United States of America. Okay, last point here. The Congress established itself as the central governing authority under the Articles of Confederation. So we don't have a constitution yet, actually. These were the Articles of Confederation, which remained in force until 1788, which is where more important things happened. That's when the Constitution came about, was in 1788. But for the first decade or so, about 12 years, I think, there was actually no Constitution. They had they had something else instead of the Constitution, which was the Articles of Confederation. We'll see why those ended up actually not working out. Okay? So, Benji, can you read these next two paragraphs before the picture?
Sure.
Fighting the Revolutionary War.
In April 1775, at Lexington and Concord, in Massachusetts, war between Britain and its North American colonies broke out. In order to direct the war effort and begin debating the contours of the system of the government that would emerged to replace British rule. Delegates from all 13 colonies convened in Philadelphia in the summer of 1775. The most pressing order of business was the war effort. It was not unified, nor were the many leaders who could potentially command the desperate armed forces, which at this point were mostly composed of various local militias. In June, the delegates voted to raise an army through the conscription and appointed George Washington to command the new Continental Army.
Okay, so what was the main thing that was decided from the first Continental Congress, which was about a year before this? What was kind of the main thing they decided? Were they like 100% sure that they were going to be their own independent country at that time?
No.
Not really. Obviously, those ideas were everywhere because there was a lot of revolutionary ideas going around. But what was the main thing they decided to do? Had to do with imports and exports. What was the decision they made in response to the Intolerable Acts towards Boston? The colonies had come together and they made a decision in response to the Intolerable Acts. We just read about it. They were going to ban what?
British imports.
Imports or
Exports.
they were going to ban exports to Britain, to the mother country. So to Ireland, to Britain, to the British West Indies. And just trying to remember a few details about it because this is important. I'm actually going to assign you guys a test today, by the way, and I'll tell you, you're not doing the test today. You're going to be studying for it for next week. But this is helping you remember stuff and also give you a chance to review during this week. But let's look at the details a little bit. Let's be as precise as we can here. Who was that going to affect the most? Which colonies? The southern colonies. Why?
Because
They needed the goods to make money.
Essentially, yeah. The significant source of their income, their revenue, basically money, in order to function well, came from the exports that they sent to Britain. Things like cotton and rice, and I don't know if tobacco was still a thing then too, but I think it was. Anyways, and they did what in response to that? What compromise did they reach?
they waited a year or two.
Yeah, they would wait a year in
Oh.
order to give the southern colonies a chance to prepare for that. Okay, now, about a year later, the Revolutionary War had started, and therefore in the Second Continental Congress, the main order of business was how are they going to respond? Like, how are they going to organize troops and generals and commanders to be able to fight in this war effectively? That was the first thing that needed to be discussed, as Benji just read. But there were more things to be discussed in this Second Continental Congress. Now, Naomi, can you read the radicals and conservatives at the Second Continental Congress section?
There were two main factions represented at the Congress.
So, what are factions, by the way?
Factions.
Yeah. Like, just to give a modern example of a faction, Democrats and Republicans, innocent. Those are parties, technically, but you know how some people think very liberally and others think conservatively? You guys have noticed those political differences that people have?
Yes.
Those are factions. So some people think one way and have one solution to something, and the other people have another way. And so what's bound to happen between these two groups?
They're about to disagree with.
Yeah, disagreement, argument. So that's what factions are. So there are two factions that are happening even in this time, and they're supposed to be united together. So Naomi, go ahead.
The conservatives, headed by John Jay of New York and John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, and the radicals, led by John Adams of Massachusetts and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. The conservatives still believed that reconciliation with the British was possible. And on July 5th, the Congress authorized the Olive Branch Petition, which
It is not that funny.
represented the final attempt at negotiation and affirm the colony's loyalty to the crown.
So what are the conservatives thinking in the midst of all this?
Sorry.
What are they thinking? They still think that they can do what? The colonies as a whole can do what?
What's that word again? That I couldn't say.
Reconciliation.
Reconciliation. That means to reunite with or restore friendly relations with. So they think basically that they can or that reconciliation with the British is possible. They're actually that implies that they may be against the sentiment that America could become its own nation. They still want to reestablish relations with the British Empire. And so, what does an olive branch typically mean? Do you guys remember? It's a symbol of what?
I don't really remember that.
Life.
I think it's usually like an olive branch is a symbol of peace or something like that. So it's the olive branch petition, which as Naomi just read, represented one final attempt to negotiate with and affirm the colony's loyal to the British Crown. Okay, Naomi, go ahead.
However, the following day, the Congress issued the Declaration of Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, which explained and justified the 13 colonies' decision to go to war. This had the effect of invalidating the olive branch petition, which the British summarily rejected.
So the conservatives' efforts kind of went to trash. The war pretty much did seem to be inevitable. So the radicals, what do you think, if the conservatives are wanting to reestablish relations with the British, what do you think the radicals are wanting to do? If they are thinking almost in the complete opposite way.
They're trying to start war.
Yeah, they want, and because in the end they want what?
Land?
They want to be separate from the British Empire. They want to be their own country, potentially. Okay, go ahead, Naomi.
Though the ideas of the conservatives continued to be debated in the Congress,
Those ideas were still there.
the battles at, how do you say that?
Lexington and Concord.
Lexington and Concord, at the subsequent siege of the Boston,
Which happened afterwards, which is what that means.
pushed many of the delegates into the radical camp.
So as the war played out, more and more people were siding with the radicals. Okay, they were saying, yeah, there's conservative ideas at this point, which are wanting to reestablish connections with British Empire. Those aren't really going anywhere. So everybody started to, most people, I think the majority, begin to side with the radical idea of things. All right, so here's an important section here. I'll read this for us. Declaring independence. The Second Continental Congress assumed the normal functions of a government. So they appointed ambassadors, issued paper currency, raising Continental Army through conscription, and appointing generals to lead the army. Those are all things that a government would do, rather than the British doing that. Obviously, in this case, since they're against the British, they're starting to do this themselves. So they're starting to function as if they are their own government now. The powers of the Congress were still very limited, however. It did not have authority to raise taxes, nor did it have the ability to regulate commerce. On July 4th, 1776, the important date, the Congress took a momentous step and issued the Declaration of Independence. Although the delegates were partly motivated by the necessity of securing foreign allies, particularly to the French. So the French were allies, obviously, to the Americans in the Revolutionary War. To assist with the war effort against Britain, many of them also understood that the time for negotiations was over. Nothing short of full independence would suffice. Thomas Jefferson composed the first draft of the Declaration, which was then edited by other delegates to produce the final version that was approved on July 4th. So there's the picture of the Congress voting for independence.
Oh, my hair.
Yeah, those I think, like, sitting to the left with the white suit on, I think that might be... I don't know who that is, actually. Looks like it could be Benjamin Franklin, I'm not sure. All right, I'll read the second part, too. Waging war and making peace. As the delegates sought to direct the war effort, they were also looking ahead to the end of the war and the government that would replace British rule. So, as I was saying, the Second Continental Congress, obviously, the pressing matter at hand was how to respond to the war, but another pressing matter was if we were to make it out of this war, how are we going to govern ourselves? That's a really important thing to consider. What should this government look like? What would be its obligations to citizens? And most importantly, what checks on its power could be put in place so as to prevent another form of tyranny from arising? So, obviously there were many ideas probably spreading around about what this government would look like, but a prevailing one was we don't want it to be like the British Empire, which ruled in a sort of dictatorship way. Does that make sense? Like it was a constitutional monarchy at that time, but they wanted something that gave more freedom to citizens, which is the whole American idea, right? After months of fierce debate, on November 15th, 1777, the Congress adopted the Articles of Confederation, which established a unicameral legislature. A unicameral means having a single legislative chamber, which in this case would be Congress. Legislative has to do with what? The making of laws, right? That served as the fledgling nation's governing authority until 1788, so that was 1777 to 1778 was the time during which the Articles of Confederation were active. The Continental Congress effectively transformed a collection of disparate colonies, so like all the different colonies which were at that time sort of separated, which had to come together during this time, into a country under a functioning central government. And the Articles of Confederation served as the Constitution of the United States until 1789. And we'll look into that later. Okay, so now let's go down to the creating a nation section here, which you guys reviewed this week. And were you guys able to take notes and stuff during this time a little bit?
A little bit.
So can you guys tell me a little bit about the Articles of Confederation? What you learned about that? There were, I think, 2 different videos about it at the beginning there. What did you learn about that?
Well, it wasn't like a very good, like, it didn't really, it was like pretty loose, like it was a loose set of rules
Mm-hmm.
that was governing.
They made sure to point out some weaknesses about the Articles of Confederation in the videos, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it was eventually due to the weaknesses that it had that they eventually had the Constitutional Convention and replaced the Articles of Confederation with the Constitution of the United States. So what were some of those weaknesses? We pointed out a few.
Well, like Esther said, that they're very loose. There's pretty much like temporary laws. Like,
What had an insignificant amount of power due to the Articles of Confederation?
Wait, what do you mean?
So there, I guess I'll just say it, the United States government, which was formed as a result of the Articles of Confederation, had it didn't have a significant amount of power specifically over the states or the colonies, right? And so what sort of things limited its power? Like, what was it not able to do? Do you guys remember from the videos? They probably drew those points out.
they weren't able to raise taxes on people, weren't they?
I think
Yeah,
I
they
think that
couldn't
was
really
one
raise
of them.
money.
Yeah. It wasn't able to regulate commerce and stuff too.
So
I
they
think,
couldn't-
right?
Yeah.
What is commerce again?
Just like trading,
Okay.
like importing and exporting
Yeah.
between colonies, and even the states, in many ways, still had the ability to trade with other countries that were outside of the United States. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the Constitutional Convention section there, or article, I mean.
Wait, which one? There's two of them.
The article.
The article,
Oh,
yeah.
sorry.
And this will, I think, give us a bit of a review of why the Articles of Confederation weren't working. So, the overview here. Between May and September 1787, I'm sure everybody's on the article, delegates from 12 states convened in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation, which had proven insufficient to cope with the challenges facing the young nation. The convention was the site of spirited debate over the size, scope, and structure of the federal government, and its result was the United States Constitution. The notorious 3/5 Compromise apportioned representation to the southern slaveholding states in a scheme that counted 5 enslaved men and women as 3. It's kind of an interesting point.
Yeah.
That even is kind of a part of debate even today, I think. So, Elijah, go ahead and read the first, or the paragraphs up until the picture. Creating a new government.
From May 25th to September 17th, 1787, 55 delegates from 12 states convened in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. Rhode Island was the only state that refused to send representatives to the convention, which assumed that its primary task was to as its primary tasks
The revision.
the revision or replacement of the Articles of Confederation. Though the Articles of Confederation had provided the framework for governance since the declaration of the American Revolution against Britain, many of the fledgling nation's political leaders agreed that the creation of a stronger central government was essential to the development of the power and the potential of the United States. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government lacked the power of
Like Esther was
legislation.
saying. I said, like Esther was saying there.
Had no authority to regulate commerce and was impotent to resolve conflicts arising between states.
Now, we covered in this section an important event that happened. It was a rebellion. Whose rebellion was it?
Shay's.
Shay's rebellion. What happened? Why did the rebellion happen?
It was a bunch.
Cause he
Go ahead.
couldn't get taxes. He didn't have like taxes and stuff, right?
No, I don't think exactly. These were, most of the people that participated in the rebellion were what?
Farmers and angry.
Mostly,
I can't-
there were people that participated in the Revolutionary War. A bunch
Okay.
of soldiers and generals.
Veterans.
And why did, veterans, exactly. Why did they get upset though? They just fought for the nation. Why are they getting upset at the nation now? Do you guys
I
remember?
thought it was because they didn't have money.
It is why. They didn't get paid, and they essentially did not get paid for their service. And a lot of other pretty terrible things happened too with their land and the rights they had and different things like this. And that is one of the reasons that the Articles of Confederation were revised, was because, in a sense, even the federal government at this time wasn't even able to respond to this rebellion very well.
Yeah, 'cause they didn't have money either.
Yeah, because this new nation was not working well under the Articles of Confederation. So the 3 reasons they gave us was what Elijah just read there. So, okay, keep going there. And because of this, what does the federal government need more of?
Taxes.
It's just a general word and concept. They need more power and authority, right? And
Yeah.
so why do you think some people would be a little wary of that?
They don't
Because
want to be like.
they said before that they that they wouldn't have power over the people, like
Yeah,
that much power.
There's a push against that. Like the whole point of us having broken from the British Empire is because we don't want that sort of power over us, right?
Mhm.
but a certain measure of power is needed for a nation to be governed well, right?
Right.
So they're trying to find that balance. That's why there's a lot of argument and tension right now. Okay, go ahead.
Seeking to bolster the authority of the federal government, delegates gathered at the Independence Hall in Philadelphia and elected George Washington to preside over the convention. Preside over the convention. One of the most spirited debates at the convention regarded the composition of the legislative branch of government.
Congress, yeah.
Should a legislator be uncommercial, consisting
unicameral, consisting of one house, which is what that means.
Consisting of one house, or bicameral, consisting of two houses. More importantly, how should representation in the legislature be appointed?
Apportioned. Naomi, can you read the next one for us?
James Madison proposed the Virginia Plan, which called for a
bicameral, which means it consists of two houses.
How do you say it?
Legislature.
Legislature, in which representation would be based on population. The larger states supported this plan because it would accord them a greater representation based on their more numerous populations. However, the smaller states opposed it and submitted a competing proposal, the New Jersey Plan. According to this scheme, which was basically inherited from the Articles of Confederation, the legislature would be how do you say that again?
Unicameral,
and each state would be a single vote. So what are these two things again?
So this is a problem, okay? Each state, do all these states or colonies, do they all have the same population? No, some populations are far greater than others, especially in southern states where not only are there a lot of people, but there are a far higher consistency of slaves, right? Mm-hmm. So the southern colonies, I think, during that time were far more populated than the northern colonies were.
Okay. So what are
so we had the Virginia Plan, which was proposed by James Madison, and he said that it would be best if there was a bicameral or two-house legislature in which representation. So representation, right? You guys know what that is? Basically, people electing individuals to be within the legislature to make laws, right? Everybody wanted to say in what laws were made, okay? This is the whole structure of this government. What were you saying?
I was saying that, and he wanted like both the small states and the big states to have the same.
Well, what he was saying here is that essentially the amount of representatives that a colony or a state had was based on how big their population was. Okay? So say you had somewhere like North Carolina versus Rhode Island, which is going to have the bigger population out of those two.
Okay.
Yeah. So North Carolina as a state would have more representatives. And that kind of doesn't seem fair for Rhode Island, right? Even though North Carolina does in fact have more people, this is more representation for a single state than for Rhode Island, which would have less representation, even though it is a single state, just like North Carolina is. So there's a lot of argument going on here. Let's see. In contrast to the Virginia plan that was proposed by James Madison, we have here the New Jersey plan, which obviously was put forth by the smaller states. And as it says here, this was kind of adopted from the the Constitution that they're revising, which is the Articles of Confederation. And according to the New Jersey plan, instead of a bicameral, they would have a unicameral or one-house legislature in which each state, regardless of their population, would have one vote or a single vote. So these are kind of in contrast with the other. And here we're going to see another compromise take place. So I'll read this. Drafting the Constitution. The delegates ultimately combined elements of both plans. See how compromises work? They take a little bit from each side of the argument and they reach a compromise. We let go of some stuff, The other side will let go of some things, and will combine our desires, in a sense, to find a solution. They combined elements of both plans in what became known as the Connecticut Compromise. So that's important. That's an important phrase to remember, the Connecticut Compromise. The legislative branch would be bicameral, so they'd have two houses. These are going to sound familiar to us because we still use it today. Consisting of an upper house, which is the Senate, and a lower house, House of Representatives. Representation in the House would be based on population, okay? So the lower house, which were going to be the representatives, were going to be, this is a piece of the Virginia plan, right? Where representation is based on population. That's the House of Representatives. We still do this today. This is the same structure of of Congress today. Representation in the House would be based on population, and each state was allotted 2 seats in the Senate, which is a piece of what plan that we just saw?
The New Jersey.
The New Jersey plan, yeah. Each state has its own, or has an equal amount of representation in the Senate. 2 senators for each state, regardless of population. It's the House of Representatives that have population based off of how many people are in a state. Okay? The office of the president would constitute the executive authority and was to be chosen by the Electoral College, which we won't get into detail now. The structure of government would be federalist in nature. Let's look up the definition of federalist. Basically, someone who, in a sense, supports a central authority, like the United States government. Consisting of 3 independent branches. What are those branches?
Legislative, Congress, and executive.
Judicial.
Yes. Wait, what was this at?
Oh.
You said legislative and Congress, the same thing.
Oh.
The legislative branch,
No,
which is
no.
Congress. The executive branch, which is what?
Oh.
What's the executive branch?
The
It was
president.
The president. The president and the president's cabinet, yeah. And the judicial branch, which was the Supreme Court and the court system, yeah. So, the Congress, the executive, the president, and the judicial, the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, which they are only just now mentioning, would adjudicate disputes. Adjudicate means to judge or reach a decision on, according to a specific standard of justice. Adjudicate disputes between states, and Congress was authorized to levy taxes, declare war, raise an army, regulate interstate commerce, and draft laws consistent with the purpose of exercising these powers. These are all points that are explicitly written in the Constitution, which is pretty much the most famous document, American document there is, along with the Declaration of Independence. The Compromise also addressed another major point of contention between northern and southern states over the issue of slavery, okay? So this is kind of a interesting compromise here. Should enslaved people be counted for the purpose of a state's representation in Congress? And if so, how? The northern states did not think enslaved people should be counted at all, while the southern slaveholding states thought they should. Now, why is that? Why would the southern states want their slaves to count as people that can vote? Because if they did, they'd have more voters on their side, right? If the slaves were able to count as a part, didn't have the right to vote. That's not what I'm saying. They counted as, each slave counted as a full person. If that was the case, then their population would be bigger, and therefore they would have more representation through the House of Representatives, right? Because each slave would count as a person, making it to where their population is far greater. That's why the northern colonies were saying, no, that's not fair. All your slaves should count as nobody, which is kind of rude. The 3/5 Compromise established that enslaved men and women would be represented in the House at a ratio of 3 to 5 of their actual numbers. And so what was that saying? That was essentially saying that one slave counted as 3/5 of a person. So that's why there's a lot of kind of racism debate over this. No, over this particular instance in the creation of, because people try to find weak points in the way our government and country was set up and things like that. So they're kind of, I think it's a little bit silly, but they're bringing this up in this article. Thus, every 5 individuals would count as 3 for the purposes of both legislative representation and taxation. The 3/5 Compromise was one of the most notorious provisions of the Constitution. I'll just skip back that. Going to ratifying the Constitution. Esther, can you read the rest of this article?
Ratifying the Constitution. Before the Constitution could take effect, it had been ratified.
It had to be ratified.
Had to be ratified. Formally approved by assemblies of at least 9 of the 12 states that had sent delegates to the convention.
So this Constitution had to be agreed on by at least 9 out of the 12 states for it to work or to be put into practice.
Ironically enough, after the
Acrimonious, which means really bitter and angry.
debates over legislative representation, the small states were the first to ratify the Constitution.
Interesting.
The most serious opposition to ratifying the document came from the larger states of Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia. These states were home to large rural populations that sympathized with the plight of farmers like Daniel Shays, who had spearheaded a rebellion against what he perceived as the unjust economic policies and the political corruption of Massachusetts state legislature. According to many of the Constitution's opponents, it would create a large, intrusive, and much too powerful federal government that would inevitably recreate the tyranny that the Patriots had fought against in the American Revolution. In order to combat this opposition and get the Constitution ratified, a series of amendments known as the Bill of Rights was appended to the document to ensure that the federal government will respect the natural rights of the citizens.
So we see here that, interestingly enough, it was the small states, obviously the ones with the lesser populations, that were the first to ratify the Constitution or see it as valid and as something that the country needed. But it was the bigger states like Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia that were worried about it. Their argument basically was, we don't want to recreate something we literally just fought against. We were just discussing that earlier. And so, once again, we have another compromise come up. And what is that compromise? It was the last thing we just read.
It's on top of me.
It's right there.
Bill of Rights.
The Bill of Rights. That was the compromise. And what did the Bill of Rights do for us? Did they have an article on that? Yeah.
Yeah, they have one.
Yep.
The Bill of Rights.
To ensure the federal government would respect the natural rights of the citizens.
Right. And so we're going to look at that next time, I think. Because what the Bill of Rights did is it gave rights to specifically individual citizens of the country that were basically supposed to protect them from basically the things they feared from a federal government, which had control, which through the Constitution, this new Constitution, had far more power and authority now.
Okay.
That's what the Bill of Rights was protecting citizens against. We'll look at what as a part of the Bill of Rights. You'll recognize things like freedom of speech and things like that. Those are the Bill of Rights. Okay, so we're going to be looking at things like the Federalist Papers and the Bill of Rights next time if we can. But what I'm going to have you guys do is, best you can and as much as you want to, review both sections, the American Revolution, Creating a Nation. Doesn't mean you have to watch every video, read every article, do every quiz. But what you guys are going to do is take the unit test, which is right there. You guys see that?
Oh, that's what I did.
You already took it?
I got everything on Creating a Nation, but I reset these and I didn't get it.
Oh,
Where?
I did do the wrong test. Oops.
Well, I did
Go down.
these.
I didn't do too good. That's why I was like,
I got 56%. But I got
Oh, bummer. Wish you guys didn't take that.
I thought you told us to.
I didn't.
Okay, well,
Were you wanting to do that?
yes, I'm going to have you guys, don't take it again. Don't take it until next time we get together. But what you guys are going to do next week is you're going to take this test at the same time, just like we would do a normal test here. And I'm also going to have one or two questions that you're going to write, like a short 5-6 sentence essay to, and as a part of that time. They're going to be questions that you have to respond to in your own words. Okay? Those are going to be together. So this unit test only has 9 questions, but the 2 prompts that I'm going to give you are going to relate to what we read in this particular section. All right?
Okay.
So do your study in order to be ready for that.
Yes, sir.
And that will conclude today.